So you don't need me to tell you that life is pretty amazing. Yeah, the fact that life arose at all on Earth is somewhat of a miracle that required this incredible confluence of just the right conditions. And how life actually began, right at the very beginning, still remains somewhat of a mystery. Now, when you look at the fantastic array of life forms that make up the biosphere on Earth, what you see is extraordinary complexity as well as extraordinary diversity. From plants to algae, bacteria, fungi, insects, and all the animals, birds, fish, reptiles, mammals, etc. It's this almost bewildering, technicolor array of matter become animate. And each individual organism, from the very smallest all the way to the largest, is like a mini self-regulating open system, in constant exchange with its surrounding environment, exchanging both matter as well as energy that they need in order to sustain their form. And in doing so, they modify the surrounding environment. So when you scale these effects from the level of the individual organism through to populations and communities, to whole ecosystems and whole biomes, you have a living force that can literally shape the surface of an entire planet. So beneath the apparent diversity of life lies an incredible unity. Now, indigenous cultures all over the world have long recognized plants and animals as being our sisters and brothers and close cousins. And in the last 30 years or so, as science has begun to unravel the secrets of DNA, we've discovered that they couldn't have been more correct. You, me, all of us share enormous amounts of our DNA with the plants and the animals that we see on a daily basis. In fact, about half our DNA is the same as a tree. We are all related, and we share common ancestors in deep time. Some close, some more distant. However, the diversity that we see now in life was not always like this. There's been multiple points in Earth's history where life has almost been wiped out. It's been taken right to the very brink. In fact, for most of Earth's history, life was a bacterial soup, dominated by single-celled anaerobic bacteria. And so the multicellular diversity that we see now is a pretty recent invention. In fact, of all of the inventions of life, perhaps the most significant was when a little bacteria developed the ability to take CO2 from the atmosphere, combine it with water from the hydrosphere, and using light energy from the sun was able to synthesize carbohydrates and sugars, and basically store electrons as chemical energy in complex organic molecules. And that was photosynthesis. Total game changer. It literally altered the planet, and it altered the planet in two main ways. First of all, was by this capturing of energy from the sun and storing it and accumulating it as chemical energy on an industrial scale. And the second was the production of oxygen as a waste product. And the fact that it was oxygen was really important because oxygen is super reactive. It just wants electrons and will react with pretty much anything to get them. And this changed the chemistry of the oceans, it changed the chemistry of rocks, it altered the composition of the atmosphere, drawing down CO2, oxidizing some of the methane, so decreasing its concentration, and then slowly increasing the concentrations of free oxygen over time. Basically introducing free oxygen for the first time in the atmosphere. This caused the first mass extinction event on the planet, and the slow accumulation of oxygen over time also led to the formation of the ozone layer, which then shielded us from harmful UV radiation from the sun. And all of these things combined set the stage for a huge explosion in life about 500 million years ago. And that, as well as a few other things, is going to be the topic of this and the subsequent mini-lecture. So a quick overview of this mini-lecture. We're going to start with some pretty big questions like, what is life? We'll also look at what we know about how life actually began. And then we'll take a little bit of a look at how life is organized in terms of the hierarchy of complexity, all the way from individual cells right up to the level of the biosphere. And then we'll look at where it is that life thrives. Yeah, we'll define the life zone, both on land and in the oceans, and we'll take a brief look at biomes as well. And then we'll get into the really juicy part, which is really about life from a planetary perspective, and we'll explore the history of life's impacts on the Earth systems, with that real focus on photosynthesis, the buildup of oxygen, as well as the impacts on the carbon cycle. And then finally, we'll wrap up by taking a little bit of a look at life in the Phanerozoic, which is the last sort of 500 million years or so, and briefly touch on extinction events. So what is life? Well, life is clearly different from atoms and minerals and rocks, and it's defined by characteristics such as order and structure and complexity. But there's four really essential attributes that really make life unique. The first of those is metabolism. This is the ability to use and process energy. And there are two major types of metabolism. The first is what we call autotrophy. And so autotrophic organisms basically make their own energy. So this includes photosynthesis, as a plant and algae that create their energy out of light, combining that with CO2 and water to make sugars and starches, etc. There are also another minor group of autotrophs called chemosynthesizers, and they make their own energy but out of chemical pathways. The second major type of metabolism is what we call heterotrophy, and heterotrophic organisms eat others for energy. So that's us. It includes most animals, most bacteria, and fungi as well. And so heterotrophs are getting their energy from the stored chemical energy that's in the organic molecules of the bodies of others. So the second major component of life is that of reproduction. Life makes copies of itself, and it does that through DNA. So DNA is basically the blueprint that contains the codes that enables life to reproduce copies. A third major component of life is growth. Now this doesn't just mean a small thing becoming a bigger thing, like as an organism grows, but more importantly it involves the ordering and organizing of atoms and small molecules to make larger molecules, or potentially organs and larger complex structures. And the fourth component of life is that of evolution. Life evolves over time, and it does that through passing on hereditary traits which are coded in the DNA. So how did life arise? Well, this remains a pretty big mystery. We have some hypotheses, but at this point we're still uncertain, for sure. We do know, however, that life evolved or rose pretty early on. We think about 3.9 billion years ago, thereabouts. And it's around then we start seeing the first kind of chemical signatures of life in rock. The very first fossils that we know definitely came from life and living organisms are dated at around about 3.5 billion years old. And one of the reasons we think it also started early is that there were some pretty unique conditions on early Earth that we don't see replicated here under current Earth conditions. So amongst the various hypotheses we have, the first one is what they call the primordial soup hypothesis. And this is essentially the idea that hydrocarbons, which were abundant in the early oceans, would have been possibly converted to more complicated organic molecules via electricity, in the form of lightning. And there's been a series of famous experiments that were done to demonstrate that you can indeed create these complex organic molecules by running electricity through a primordial soup that is loaded with hydrocarbons. A second major hypothesis is what they call a black smoker hypothesis, and this idea is that complex organic molecules may have catalyzed on the mineral surfaces that were found in ocean volcanic events, the surfaces of minerals such as pyrite, or possibly even the layers between clays as well, where the orderly atomic arrangement on the mineral surface provides a template via which more simple hydrocarbons can arrange themselves into more complicated organic molecules. The third major hypothesis is what they call the panspermia hypothesis. Essentially, this is the idea that some of the building blocks of life may have come from outside the solar system, possibly in the form of debris from comets. However, at this point, we do not know which of these hypotheses might be true, if indeed any of them are. So life consists of a nested structural complexity, which is represented by this diagram you can see here over on the right, which is from page 423 in your textbook, and it's a really good one. And you see this sort of ascending order of complexity all the way from atoms down near the bottom, and atoms are the basis of molecules. Molecules are the basis of cells. Cells are the basis of tissues. Tissues combined are the basis of organs. Organs are the basis of organ systems. And organ systems are the basis of organisms. And enough organisms are the basis of populations. Populations are the basis of communities and ecosystems. Then to biomes, and then the whole biosphere, etc. And what we will be focusing on, and what we do focus on in this unit, is that we tend to cover both spectrums. We're up here at the level of the Earth and the biosphere, but we also have covered molecules and atoms as well. Now, in terms of understanding life and the biosphere in more detail, and all of this middle zone that you see in here, that's covered in other units in the degree program, particularly cells and molecules and organisms and environments. That's where you go into much more detail about the sort of structural complexity in this middle zone here, all the way from cells up to ecosystems. And just wanted to point that out so that you know how what we're teaching, where it fits in the degree program, and how some of the other units will fit in. So the life zone is a pretty simple concept, and basically this is this narrow band on Earth where the geosphere, the hydrosphere and the atmosphere all come together. And most life is located within this narrow sort of blanket that spans the Earth. It's no wider than about 20 kilometres, and it extends to the very bottoms of the ocean up to the very tips of the highest mountains. But interestingly, actually, there's an even narrower band within that where most of the biosphere and most biomass and living organisms are located. And that zone extends from the very upper parts of the ocean where the light penetrates, up to about 1,000 metres in elevation. In fact, most of the biosphere is within those limits. So I'd like to briefly introduce you to the concept of biomes, terrestrial biomes, and essentially these are major ecosystem types that are spread across the continent. This map here shows the distribution of major biomes across the surface of the Earth. Everything from the tundra, which is located up in the Arctic, obviously, to subtropical rainforests, to arid deserts, to savanna, etc. Now, you can see that there's some clear patterns here, and one of the primary controls on the distribution of the biomes is temperature and precipitation. They're the two major things that really influence where the biomes are located. And because of this, atmospheric and ocean circulation also play a really big role because they influence both temperature and precipitation. Now, if you look at the distribution of biomes over geological time on the continents, they've also shifted around as the continents have moved around on the face of the Earth, because the continents have shifted their latitude over time, which has changed their temperature. Great example would be Australia. So 60 million years ago, Australia used to be a lot further south, so it was a lot cooler and it had more precipitation. So back then we had a much greater abundance of forest biomes versus the desert that we have now. Okay, so this is where we get into a really juicy bit about how life impacted and changed the Earth system over time. And we're going to use this diagram here as a bit of a timeline over on the right for the next few slides, where you've got the start of Earth's evolution about 4.5 billion years ago down the bottom, all the way up through to now at the top. So initially, in those really early periods in the early atmosphere, there was no free oxygen whatsoever. Yeah, so if you could take a time machine and go back there, you would die because you wouldn't be able to breathe because there was no oxygen. But there was a lot more CO2 and a lot more methane, and as a result, the greenhouse effect, if you like, in the Earth's atmosphere was a lot stronger. So it was actually quite warm back then as well. And the very first life that arose was anaerobic. Yeah, and what's really important about anaerobic life is that anaerobic metabolism is not efficient. Yeah, it yields a really small amount of energy. And so what this means is that anaerobic organisms don't have a lot of spare energy. They don't have energy to create complex structures or multiple cells or to exchange actively with their environment. They're basically really simple single-celled organisms, and they're small, and they can't get very big and they can't get complicated because they don't have spare energy to do anything with. So life remained like that for a long time, whilst the atmosphere had no free oxygen. Yeah. Now, the earliest fossils, as I mentioned previously, date back to about 3.5 billion years ago, and there are also the earliest sort of signs or chemical signatures of life dating back to around 3.94 billion years ago that are found in rocks. So photosynthesis began around about 3.2 billion years ago, and we think that the initial organism was a cyanobacteria. And as I mentioned at the very beginning introduction to this mini lecture, it was a total game changer. Yeah, this combination of light energy plus CO2 and water leading to energy being stored in chemical bonds, basically in the form of sugars and carbohydrates. One way of thinking about it is that these organic compounds, the sugars and carbohydrates, are essentially storing electrons, in the form of a solid. And at the same time, oxygen is being produced as a waste product and going into the atmosphere. And oxygen wants those electrons back really, really badly, and it's in the form of, obviously, as a gas. Now, this is important, and I'll come back to it in a couple of slides when I talk about aerobic metabolism. So essentially what happened is the composition of the atmosphere started changing as an oxygen waste product slowly started accumulating. CO2 started being drawn down out of the atmosphere and stored in organic molecules. And however, the changes in the composition of the atmosphere were initially fairly slow, particularly the accumulation of oxygen itself. And the reason for this is that oxygen is just so chemically reactive. It'll basically oxidize and react with anything that's got a slightly spare electron. It'll steal them away. And so it reacted with elements in the rocks, it reacted with minerals, and it reacted with elements in the ocean. So essentially, for a long period of time, there were chemical reactions that were mopping up oxygen that was being produced before it had a chance to accumulate too much in the atmosphere. And this led to really big changes in the chemistry of the oceans between about 3.7 and 2.5 billion years ago. And one of the big things that happened was related to iron. And so originally, when the atmosphere had no oxygen in it, the oceans were rich in dissolved iron too. So they were kind of green, the oceans way back then. And loads of iron that was all dissolved in the water. And then as the oxygen was being produced, the oxygen reacts with iron 2 really, really quickly, and it forms iron 3 oxides, which is basically rust. And rust is insoluble. So what happened is the rust started settling out of the water column, on the bottom of the ocean. And over time, all this huge quantities of iron basically completely settled out and sat on the bottom of the ocean and became part of the rock cycle. It was lithified, and it forms what we now know as the banded iron deposits, which you can see a picture of here in the bottom right-hand side. Now, these deposits are found all around the world. Some of the largest deposits in the world are found in Australia, in Western Australia. So this is where the iron ore that Australia sells to China comes from, thanks to the actions of a bacteria some 3-odd billion years ago. So as oxygen slowly accumulated in the atmosphere, it created conditions that were suitable for the formation of ozone, or O3. And the build-up of the ozone layer in the stratosphere was so important because basically acted as a shield to prevent harmful UV radiation from hitting the surface of the Earth. And this created conditions that enabled life to come out from the oceans and out of the protective sort of layer, if you like, that water in the oceans provided, and come out onto the surface of the planet for the first time. And if we didn't have the ozone layer now, life would be on the surface of the Earth anyway, would be pretty much wiped out because the harmful UV radiation would sterilize pretty much everything. So the accumulation of sufficient free oxygen in the atmosphere provided an opportunity for the development of aerobic metabolism. And this was really important because it allowed large complex organisms to develop. And the reason why is because anaerobic metabolism is really, really efficient. It yields a much, much higher amount of energy than anaerobic metabolism. And in a way, you can think of it almost like a controlled burn, if you like. It's an oxidation between the solid food, which is the organic molecules with their stored electrons, and oxygen as a gas, which takes those electrons. And this releases an enormous amount of energy. Think about when you take a piece of firewood and you burn it in a fire. The sunlight energy, which is stored in those chemical bonds, is released and as an enormous amount of heat from that firewood. In a way, aerobic metabolism, like what we do, is very, very similar, except there's no flame, but it is an oxidation process and it releases extraordinary energy. And with that energy, you can have multi-celled organisms because they have got all this spare energy, so they can create larger structures that are complex. And this is exactly what happened. However, oxygen is also really, really toxic, particularly to the anaerobic bacteria. They'd had a free run for almost 2 billion years, and they nearly went extinct. It was the first mass extinction event, if you like, in the history of the Earth, because the oxygen pretty much wiped them out, and they could only survive in parts of the planet that were free of oxygen, oxygen-free niches. And they still survive to this day in parts of the planet where there is no oxygen, such as saturated organic-rich sediments, like sediments at the very bottom of the ocean, or say mangrove swamps, or in wetlands. That's where you can still find your anaerobic bacteria. So not only did oxygen accumulate, but carbon dioxide was also drawn down. Life had a really huge effect on the carbon cycle by sequestering carbon. And this wasn't just in the form of organic molecules, but it really got going in a big way once marine organisms developed the ability to make shells out of calcium carbonate. So it's taking bicarbonate in the seawater and turning it into this solid calcium carbonate form. This is essentially removing CO2 from the atmosphere. And as the shells deposit, over time they form limestone and become a sedimentary rock, and that carbon becomes part of the rock cycle. So this is a reservoir with a really long residence time. And it's very, very important in having drawn down CO2 in the atmosphere. This chart here shows concentrations of carbon dioxide over geological time. So you've got carbon dioxide on the y-axis, and on the bottom axis, the x, you have time in millions of years, with 0 over on the far left and 500 million years back here. And you can see the carbon dioxide concentrations, as we've been able to estimate from the rock record, has gone up and down over time, and you can see it was a lot higher back 500 million years or so ago, and it was life that really played a major role in drawing down that CO2 and sequestering it in sediments and becoming part of the rock cycle. Now, if all of the CO2 that's currently stored in limestone and sedimentary rocks was released, we would have as much CO2 in the atmosphere as Venus. And Venus is a pretty hot and hellish place, so obviously that would create a greenhouse gas effect that would be devastating for life as we know it. So during the Proterozoic, as the Earth was undergoing all of these pretty wild changes, we had some periods where the temperatures on Earth decreased markedly, several times. And there's evidence from the rock record, it's a little bit incomplete, but it suggests that we've had multiple phases of what they call snowball Earth, where there was literally global scale glaciation, and the Earth was essentially almost covered in ice. and this was associated with the big decreases in greenhouse gases, CO2 and methane. It was also thought to be connected with the formation of a supercontinent called Rodina, which was quite close to the equator, which led to more chemical weathering, which intensified that positive feedback loop in the carbon cycle and taking bicarbonate via weathering into the oceans, drawing down CO2. So in a nutshell, life really changed the Earth and laid down the foundations that enabled life itself to continue to thrive. And this combination of plentiful free oxygen, abundant stored chemical energy in organic molecules that have been made by photosynthesis, more moderate temperatures plus UV radiation shielding, this combination of conditions really set the stage for the Cambrian explosion at the start of the Phanerozoic around about 540 million years ago. And this is where multicellular life literally goes bananas. How do we know that life went bananas? Well, there's a huge increase in the abundance and diversity of the fossil record. And a lot happens, pretty quickly in geological time, though it's not necessarily linear. And this diagram over here on the far right represents the Phanerozoic from about 570 million years ago through to now. So we started off with the first vertebrates way back when in the Ordovician, in the form of fishes, first land plants in the Silurian about 450 million years ago. And we had the early reptiles, first insects, and the first widespread forests during the Carboniferous period. And it was in this period in the Carboniferous, around 375 to 285 million years ago, that most of our coal deposits were formed. And then we had, obviously, the first dinosaurs exploded, and for a big period of time, mammals were there also during that time as well, but it played a pretty minor role. It was dominated by dinosaurs. First flowering plants didn't rock up until about 135 million years ago, not that long ago. And then, of course, we had the rise of mammals once the dinosaurs got taken out. So while life might have gone bananas during the Phanerozoic, it hasn't always been easy. And a sobering statistic is that 99% of all species that have ever lived on the history of Earth have now gone extinct. And the background rate of extinction is generally balanced by new species evolving. However, we've had these periods over the last 500 million years or so where there's been large mass extinctions, big spikes in the loss of species from the fossil record. They suddenly just drop out. And these periods have also been followed by what we call radiations, where the number of species then suddenly diversifies again. And you can see that represented in this diagram on the bottom right, which shows a timeline during the Phanerozoic and these large extinction level events that occurred throughout that period. There's been 5 major ones, including the Permian, which you've heard me talk about before, and the one that took out the dinosaurs about 65 million years ago. Now, these were major events, and they were associated with really fast changes in the Earth system. In many cases, they've been connected to rapid shifts in climate. And some of these shifts have been connected themselves to, like, say, changes in volcanic activity, big volcanic outbursts, or plate tectonics, formation of supercontinents, changing weathering patterns. And they've often been associated with big shifts in sea levels, as well as ocean chemistry. And there's the more recent one, which we know, that took out the dinosaurs. So that's about it for this one, looking at life from a planetary and sort of deep time perspective. And in the next one, we're going to explore the chemistry of life.